so thanks ever so much, everyone, for coming again to our podcast, Neurodivergent Nook. I'm Helen Neale. I'm a counsellor, also autistic ADHD, and I'm here, as always, with Diane Franer, and I'll just let her introduce herself, actually.
Thank you, Helen. Diane here. I am also neurodivergent with ADHD and autism and dyslexia. I'm a foster carer, I'm a parent, worked in education for most of my life. The last 10 years was as a head, and I'm also a special needs consultant and one-to-one tutor.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So today, actually, we're going to be talking about masking.
Yeah.
So I guess really let's start with the basics. You know, what does masking mean for you, Diane?
Yeah, for me, I think there's two elements to how I kind of want to answer that, really. First, and then I'll forget what the second one was. First, being that, you know, as a teacher, for, you know, nearly 3 decades, knowing, you know, that children masked at school, you know, if they had trauma or neurodivergence, for example, but always kind of feeling that I didn't quite know what that meant. And as an undiagnosed teacher at the time, you know, I didn't feel like I had the knowledge myself to really understand what masking was like. You know, I would see children that would be burning out by the end of the day, or, you know, parents saying they were having meltdowns at home after school, for example. And I, you know, did all my research and my reading and my training to understand that. But I didn't really kind of get it, even though I was obviously masking at the time and not being aware that I was doing it. So kind of answering the bit about me. So I question still what masking means and what it means for me, because having only been diagnosed with autism last year and ADHD a few years ago, you know, I'm like, oh yeah, well, I must have been masking all my life. But I then kind of wonder what that means. Like, is it was it the real me? Have I always been putting on an act? I like masking sometimes. You know, if I go to a social event and I want to go to it and I have the energy to go to it, then, you know, I kind of love being there, you know, Diane's here, and kind of the mask that goes with that a little bit. And sometimes I feel okay wearing those different masks, but then I think it is hard to mask when you're doing it kind of part of a daily grind, you know, like a child going to school every day and not getting that support that they need, or whether it was me having the same job for a long time and always kind of having to mask. I think that's when it becomes really, really hard.
And so what I'm picking up from what you're saying there is that, you know, the basic concept of masking is not being your authentic self.
Yes.
Having to hold back in order to fit in.
Yes.
And particularly within neurodivergent populations, that can be incredibly tiring and very draining. Like you're scripting, for example, a social situation.
Yeah.
And it's not just that, it's the cost to yourself of doing that. So it comes with a cost.
Yeah, always. And I think that's unavoidable, you know. You know, for example, if you went to that social event and you went to that party and you were having fun, kind of being your sociable self, even if you're masking a little bit, and even if you came home and said, oh, you know, wow, I had a really great night and, you know, that was awesome and saw lots of friends, that's still going to come at the cost the next day of being completely and utterly, you know, exhausted from masking all night, or, you know, whatever the situation might be. And I think that's hard to avoid, you know, the consequences of masking for whatever reason you're doing it. Yeah.
And I think sometimes that, you know, people sometimes speak to me about, but doesn't everybody mask? And to a certain extent, that people are being adaptive and they're changing to fit in every day. But the mental and cognitive load because of the expectations of a neurodivergent population,
Yeah.
trying to fit into a world that is often not designed, and the systems that we're in, the systemic power that is there makes the cost to us huge, particularly, where, for example, and I'm trying to think of situations where it might have worked for me, and I still to this day find myself scripting and imagining what would happen when I meet someone I vaguely know but don't know really well in town, and what am I going to say, and how am I going to say it, and what they're going to think when I was, and that's going on when I've not even met someone in town.
That's just the 10-minute train journey to get there, isn't it?
Exactly. In case I maybe do meet someone on the train, and I'm thinking to myself, my cognitive load and the amount of energy that I'm expending doing that has this associated cost.
Without a doubt, 100% agree with that. And just, wanting to make sure, if you've got ADHD as well and you're a bit of a people pleaser, wanting to make sure that mask is the right fit for that scenario, isn't it? When I walk into, bump into somebody on the train, or whether, I'm walking into a meeting, or whatever the scenario might be, that I've got to make sure I'm putting on that Diane face that everybody else expects, that's what they know, and that's what's going to, I guess, help me fit into that situation. And like you just said, when you're overthinking and planning all of that for a scenario that might not even happen, or nobody might not even notice you're masking anyway, then you're doing a lot of hard work, aren't you? A lot of hard work for, maybe a 5-minute situation, and that's one example, and it's happening all day, every day, isn't it?
Yeah, and I suppose that's for someone like myself and you who now understand that a little bit more about ourselves, because we do have that sort of identity or diagnosis, whatever term you prefer, and if I think back to maybe my 12-year-old self, and I was doing all of that, I was doing it all subconsciously, didn't know I was doing it, didn't understand what it was, didn't understand the cost of that, and that's obviously one of the reasons why I was diagnosed with anxiety, is that mental load.
Can I ask, what does it make you feel like now when you think of that 12-year-old Helen?
I kind of want to give her a hug, to be honest. I think, and I there's a lot of grief around it, and I think that's a standard thing actually when we think and we look back to how much maybe we masked when we were younger, and didn't feel that we could be the real sort of me, and I'm. You can see if you watch the videos, I'm quite gregarious. I do this all the time. When I was a kid, I was told not to do that. I was told not to be too loud, not to be too much. And
you've maintained that memory still there.
And it would. I say look back to the 12-year-old me, and I think probably even at 4 and 5, and I was constantly told, stop fidgeting. Stop fidgeting. Why are you moving all the time? Because, and I'm still doing it now.
You still don't know why you're doing it.
People on the podcast can't see the fact that I'm flapping my foot while I'm talking to you.
She's flapping her foot.
And actually, I suppose if I think about it, my hyperactivity and possibly my stims when I was a bit younger, they were bigger.
Okay.
Right. And I think perhaps as I've masked more, and that's a privilege, I suppose, that I'm what might be termed lower support needs. That the sort of, I suppose, the cognitive recognition, even subconsciously, that I shouldn't be doing that, and now I'm going to do this. And actually, trying to move away from doing that with that neurodivergent population, and unless a stim is self-injurious,
of course,
is trying to embrace those stims because they have such a wonderful purpose, communication, and actually even a self-injurious stim is a communication, isn't it, really? So maybe we need to be curious about those as well.
Completely that, I was just thinking then about what you're saying about, your 12-year-old self. My parents split up when I was very young. I was only 6, and continued living with my dad. And I asked an uncle recently, what was I like as a little girl? Because I struggled to remember. And he said, that you were very quiet. And I was really close to an auntie and an uncle. You're always very quiet, but we always put it down to, your parents separating when you were young. Obviously, fast forward, didn't know that I also had autism and ADHD at the time. And I'm sure it was a combination of all of those factors that, that maybe I was a very quiet child. But and I think that I certainly wasn't a quiet teenager. Quite the opposite. I was an angry, rebellious, outrageous teenager. And I suppose, I don't know, was some of that just in response to, all of those things, or was that me masking to fit in? That now that I don't feel that I mask as much anymore, you kind of, I have all of those questions running around in my head, particularly since my autism diagnosis last year. And when do I give myself the chance to unmask? And I think, like you said, stimming, I mean, I sing an awful lot and I'm really, really terrible at singing, but that is my, or humming this repetitive tunes in my head that aren't a particular tune. But and that's yay, great, I can do that now. I couldn't do that before being a head teacher and sitting in the governors' meetings, humming away and singing random songs.
As long as your teenage daughter or son's not listening to you and tell you to shut up, that's all right.
Exactly. That's it. You can't sing, Mum. So I think I'm still learning what it is to unmask, and trying to learn and think back on when or how I was masking before to understand myself a bit more.
And it is hard, actually. Both of us obviously diagnosed much later on in life, and you kind of look back, and I remember I did an exercise, and I can't remember if I've said this before on the podcast, as a pick an animal about yourself, and I picked a chameleon, always changing, and that just means that there's an element where I'm thinking, well, who am I? Now that I know that, my brain's a little different, it thinks in a different way. What does that actually mean for me personally? And how do I unmask? And I think it's about creating and finding, and this can be really hard, those people that you feel confident in being able to be yourself, and that does sometimes that isn't the people that you might expected it would be,
or maybe even hoped that it might be. If you've been masking with a certain friend or family member for decades and decades, maybe you'd hoped that you'd get to that level in that relationship, maybe, and that's hard, isn't it? Because did you find that, maybe you've not had relationships with people for as long as you might have thought you have done, if being able to mask and kind of not mask or get in a muddle.
Well, I think I know what your meaning is that you kind of maybe expect that it's okay to unmask in front of everybody.
Well, you'd hope that,
and you want that to be, but actually sometimes it's not. And I've obviously we move in the neurodivergent community, and people have talked to me about how some friendships haven't lasted the realization and that identity, because you are becoming more authentic, and perhaps sometimes that doesn't survive some of your relationships, and that brings another grief, really, you know, to that unmasking.
Yeah.
You know, you're looking back at your masked younger self and wanting to give them a hug.
Yes.
And then you're also going through that changing in your close circle, because perhaps you're being more authentic, and perhaps people don't feel as comfortable, or you don't feel as comfortable.
Yeah, and I, you know, totally spot on, and you know, and that's happened to me with a few relationships in the last couple of years. And it's not for everyone to come on that journey with you, is it? I think, you know, especially as a late diagnosed adult. But when you learn, whether it's through diagnosis or, you know, feeling better about your identity, that you have been masking a lot of your life, I think, you know, there's that sensitive side of you that wants those people to come on that journey with you to the next bit, doesn't it? Don't you? I think, you know, that's why I said about having that grief then, because then it kind of, for me, it kind of questioned my identity then. Am I better masking? Or am I better unmasking? Should I just save the unmasking until I'm at home and keep masking outside, even though I've got autism? I shouldn't have to mask. It's exhausting.
Yeah, and it does bring with it a further layer, I guess, that realization.
Yeah.
And perhaps also that sadness that you can't do it with some people because you don't feel safe enough.
Yeah. Heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And I think, you know, what I've learned from that with my unmasking is that I've become a little bit more maybe like Marmite over the last few years. But as long as I keep my tribe, as I call them, you know, my friends that I really can unmask with, then, you know, that smaller tribe rather than that bigger group of people that I masked around is more precious, isn't it? You know, it's more unconditional.
And it's about what works for you, and that might work for you, it might not work for another autistic or ADHD. And I do think that there's an element here where I sometimes see, and you know, who's driving this thing? Is it ADHD for me at the moment? I want to go out and be social, or is it, you know, the autistic me that maybe wants to, like, you know, read a book about my special interest for 3 days straight, or whatever it is, you know, and actually it's accepting that about yourself that, you know, is actually the hardest thing.
Really hard. It's okay just to do that, you know, isn't it? That's really hard to tell yourself.
And it's okay that someone else does it in a completely different way, because we're all so different, even as neurodivergent people. And we all have different contexts, and, you know, I'm in a very privileged position where I can make that choice because of the way that I have managed to carve a career that has perhaps got quite a lot of autonomy. And I'm actually thinking back to where you started at the beginning and talking about being an undiagnosed teacher, and how there probably wasn't the capacity for you to be able to be you necessarily. And I'm you know, you asked me about the child. What would you say to that adult that didn't really understand?
To that teacher, I think if you're a good teacher, you know, you're kind of performing, you know, in the classroom for six hours a day to a certain extent. As, you know, you kind of put on your hat when the children come in, and you're, you know, and you are, you know, receptive to the children's needs until they go home. And then I think maybe I sort of thought that was what I was doing. I was being the teacher for, you know, every day. Whereas what I was probably doing was putting on my mask every time I opened the classroom doors. So maybe I was just kind of naming it as something else, identifying it as something else. But then obviously having that, you know, that burnout or that complete exhaustion at the end of a week or whatever it might be. And then I think the complicated thing about with a job like teaching is that, all teachers are shattered. So who was I to think I was more tired than my colleague? Because I didn't know I had the autism and the ADHD, and that I was also actually masking. So like you were saying it's about those layers, isn't it? Of and how can you sort of separate what those feelings are? But yeah, looking back, I think, what would I say to myself as that young teacher? Yeah, you were awesome. And I think, not that it's about masking, but what it did do from a very early start in my career is help me connect with all of those children with special needs. I just didn't know why I connected with them so well. So yeah, that became an added bonus, really.
So you had the birds of a feather flock togetger situation with neurodivergent people finding neurodivergent people, even in your a role as a teacher.
As a teacher, yeah. I can think back to different parents and whatnot now that I had really good relationships with, and thinking, oh yeah, they probably had ADHD as well. Now I think about it.
Yeah. Well, we became friends.
Exactly.
And I was diagnosed after I became friends with you.
Yeah, for sure. And an amazing connection I have with you.
So, and I do think that's the crux, I suppose, of that journey to understanding, the concept of masking. And I think maybe if we leave on something, because I'm thinking about that cognitive load for an adult, and we've talked about that.
Yeah.
What about kids, doing that in school? And you often hear about the analogy for a Coke bottle top, don't you?
Yeah.
You take it off and it happens at home, and there's an explosion, and we don't see it in school, and well, that's because ... And we've had the sort of comments around boys don't mask. I've heard that, and clearly that's just not true. It's the outdated, and we need to be bringing ourselves up to date around stuff like that. But I'm wondering what we can, are there any small changes that we can make as educators to help and support in schools?
I think that young children often don't know that they that feel the need to mask, or haven't maybe learnt that skill, I suppose. And you quite often sort of see those children that are overwhelmed, often in primary school, and of course sometimes in secondary schools. And I think when that child does unmask, maybe it's because they haven't eaten enough lunch, or that particular lesson has been particularly challenging, or they had a difficult playtime when they didn't know the rules of the game. Anything that can just make them just completely be at maximum capacity, and that mask comes off, and the school sees that as challenging behaviour, or that child needs to go, they need to go home, that's it, I'm not having any of this anymore. It happens the same time at 2:00 every day. Well, why is it happening at 2:00 every day? What are we doing, what are we thinking and learning about that child, rather than seeing it as them with their unwanted behaviours, and seeing it as it's a disruption. How do educators, I said this in a previous podcast, know that child, and know that child, so that child can safely unmask and do it in a way that they can still be regulated. And I don't think you're going to stop that outburst when you get home, when the child really unmasks, and and the poor parent or carer sees sees the disruption of their brain from that day. But children in school still need a chance to run, scream, stim, sing really loudly, or whatever it might be, muck about with fidget toys, to help them concentrate. And I think that we're still a little bit behind in that in education. There's still that kind of expectation, isn't it, of that social etiquette that, I shouldn't suddenly just start clapping my hands because I want to stim and do that, or I need to stim and do that. But I think we're a long way off allowing children and young people in education to be themselves.
And that, and I hate to leave on a sad point, but I think we need to be realistic about what is achievable.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm sure there are many teachers out there who want to be able to do more.
Of course.
And it is really about trying to adapt the environments so that those masked behaviours are acceptable and understood. And even to a certain extent, you know, encouraged. You know, they should, and I say even to a certain extent, they should be encouraged, because a lot of that masking behaviour is calming and regulating, and is communicating to us, and we need to listen.
We certainly do. Yeah.
We need to listen. So thanks so much again for listening to us.
Thank you.
And we'll be back again Tuesdays, 7 o'clock every week. So we'll be back again next week with another hopefully interesting podcast for you all. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.